Welcome to the next video in my scripting series. So the previous video, just to recap, we took a look at the importance of debugging. In this video, we are going to cover the next available logic option that we have. We've already covered assigned value, which is essentially variables. So refer to video number 1, where we talked about variables and properties. In this video, we're going to take a look at evaluate condition, what's also known as if condition or if statements. Okay, so let's get rid of the print console and let's drag in an evaluate condition node. This is what they look like. We have an if and then the condition that we're going to check for, and then we have three outputs. We have this one, we have an else, and we have an end. This is essentially what I call a then output, an else output, and an end output. Okay, this is what the code looks like in code, in text, and this is what I'm going to use to explain for the rest of the video. So what is an if statement? An if statement is basically how you check if something is the case. For example, let's say we had a local variable at the top called max equals dog. So this is a local variable with a string with the text dog inside. We could say if $max is equal to dog, then, and then in between the then and the end, we can have, let's say, a display message function that says max is a dog. Okay, and that would be, if we apply and save, that would be a script. It's not a very exciting script, and to be honest, it's always going to do this thing anyway, because we're setting the variable to dog anyway, and then we're saying if it's dog, show this message. So it's always going to show max as a dog because we're setting it to dog, and then we're checking if it's dog. But we will elaborate a little bit further. But one thing to mention first of all is if statements use two equals when you're checking if something equals something. Okay, other things we can check is, for example, if max was a number, let's say max is 100, then we could say if max is less than 100, then display message max is a dog. Doesn't make sense in this case, but you know, just showing you the types of conditional operators that you can have. So you can have less than, you can have less than or equal to, you can have greater than, so if it's bigger than 100, or if it's greater than or equal to, or you can have exactly equal to 100. Okay, now it's important to note the difference between this and this. Okay, this checks what a variable or property is set to. This sets the variable or property, or assigns it. Either way, you know, it's this one here. It's the e. You see how it's one equals there. Yeah. So if you put two equals, then it means you're checking that something equals something. So ifs would typically use two. Okay, you would never just type $max equals like that, because that's not a valid if condition, and so you're going to get an error. But you would also never have one, because it's basically trying to if $max, setting it to 100. That's just not going to work. So you want to check, is it equal to? We want the checks what a variable is set to. So it's two equals in an if condition. Yep, in an if statement. So going back to our first example where it was dog. So this is a kind of redundant script because we're setting max to dog anyway, and then we're saying if it's dog, then display message max as a dog. So it's always going to do that. Okay, but we could elaborate our script and we could say else, and then we'll just copy this display message Max is not a dog. And that's what that kind of evaluate condition would look like. You'd have this message coming out of this dot here. This is the then dot, and then the else dot comes down here to this display message. You're never going to see this particular message because it's always going to equal dog, because every time this script is executed, it's going to set it to dog. But if we were bringing a value in from somewhere else, let's say, for example, entity Justin free dot name, then let's have that be Justin. Then we can say NPC is Justin, else NPC was Sarah. Yeah. So what we're saying here is Max equals this specific character's name. And if Max is Justin, if Justin is what's come back into that local variable, then display message NPC is Justin. Otherwise, display message NPC is Sarah. Okay. Now this is great if there's only two types of possibilities. It's either Justin, and if it's not Justin, then it's Sarah, right? But what if it's Stumpy, for example? You know, or what if there's just another character? There's far more characters than two. So this isn't a particularly effective if statement because it doesn't cater for multiple different types of possibility. So another thing that you can do with if statements is we can do specific else ifs. So we can, instead of typing else, we can type else if, and then we repeat the check, but we specify what this condition should be equal to. So if Max is Justin, then display message NPC is Justin. Else if Max equals Sarah, then display message NPC is Sarah. And you can have as many of these as you want. So else if, let's just do one more. Let's say Stumpy. Then display message NPC is Stumpy. Yep. So that gives you the three possibilities of NPC that you could have. But then what you're probably also going to want is an else, because else is basically any other possibility. Okay, so this might be, for example, a message that says who on earth is this? Because it's just not an NPC that's recognized. It's not Justin, it's not Sarah, it's not Stumpy. Let's say, for example, you only had 3 NPCs in your game and you were checking for which one has come back in the name field. So you have an if statement that says, if it's Justin, then do this bit of code. If it's Sarah, do this bit of code. If it's Stumpy, do this bit of code. And then just a general good idea is to have an else, which is just, if it's not any of the above, then do something else, you know? So this is useful, for example, because if this was to come back, if I was to suddenly get a display message saying, who on earth is this while I'm playing the game, as the developer of the game, then I can suddenly go to myself, well, hang on a minute, that's not possible. I've only got 3 NPCs in my game. It has to either be Justin, Sarah, or Stumpy. So if I'm seeing this message, it means my code, for some reason, has decided that this is the case, that none of these are applicable. So this would be an instance where, again, refer to the previous video, this would be an instance if this was happening, where I would go to my script and I'd be like, well, hang on a minute, print $max, and then let's say $max comes back with Bob, and I'm like, oh, yeah, I forgot Bob, of course. So I need another else if, whatever, right? Else if $max equals Bob. then display message NPC is Bob. Or if it comes back as Bob and I don't want Bob, I'm like, where on earth has Bob come from? So the point is, if having a catch-all for your if statements is good for, it's like a good, because if we didn't have it, then what would happen is the script just wouldn't do anything. Because if it wasn't Justin, and if it wasn't Sarah, and if it wasn't Stumpy, then in this case, nothing happens. The script does nothing. It gets to the end and just ends because the script doesn't do anything at this point. So by having an else, which basically says if it's none of those, then whatever it is, do this. And then, when that happens, you'll know that it's reached this particular bit of the script, which means that for some reason, none of these were applicable, and then you can investigate why that's the case. Whereas if the script just didn't work, you wouldn't necessarily know if it's a problem with the if statement or if it's a problem with somewhere else in your code. Because in this case, it's really simple. It's a quick, simple script where the only thing in it is an if statement. But if this script was doing a ton of things and even had multiple if statements and things, and then the script just didn't do anything, then without an else, you wouldn't know why it's not doing anything. So by putting an else in that catches all the other possibilities, then that can help to pinpoint you to where a problem lies in your script. So if I had else display message oops, for example, then the moment I see oops appear on my screen, I know, oh, my if statement has for some reason failed to find the things it should be finding. Why is that? And then I can investigate that by printing the variable, for example, that's being checked to see what it's set to, and all of that sort of stuff. Okay, so if we apply and save that for a second, obviously you can see that if statements can get very complicated when you see them in the visual script. So you can add conditions on the node itself as well by just clicking this button, and then you'd fill in, $max equals whatever you want to check, and you can clear them out by pressing the cross buttons. Obviously it doesn't clear out what they were set to, so you've got to delete those as well. But anyway, so that's if statements. Now, another thing to mention before we move on to the next thing I want to talk about is if we add a bit of code after the end. So let's say we have a display image, let's say. This will happen regardless of the if condition. So let's say, for example, we had $max equals entity justin_free.name, and then we check if max is Justin, then display message NPC is Justin. Otherwise, display message NPC is someone else. Okay, so it's just anyone else besides Justin. Okay, when we run this script, it's only going to do two things. If the NPC, if max is Justin, then it's not going to do that because it equals this. So it's going to display message NPC is Justin, but then it's going to display the image. Okay. However, if we run this script and max is not Justin, then it's not going to do this, but it's going to do these two things. The point is, no matter which condition is true out of these two, it's always going to do the image. It's going to be one or two of these, either one of these, but it's always going to do display image because it's outside the if condition. So anything that's connected to the end, so coming out of the end, going down here, anything you have in this path going along here, so if we had things connected to this node, all of these things are going to happen irrespective of what the if condition is. So it doesn't matter whether max is Justin or not, these are always going to happen, these ones. Okay, So, I mean, that should be pretty self-explanatory, but I want to point that out anyway. So there's one last thing I want to talk about with ifs, and this is really important, okay? Because this is where some people can get a bit, beginners can get a bit stuck with if conditions. So let's say you had a variable called fruit, okay? And let's say it currently is set to apple, okay? Now, let's say we're not setting it in this script, okay? And obviously, ignore the fact that it's a local variable. Forget everything you know so far. This is just to explain this next concept, okay? But let's say we had a variable called fruit, okay? And it's currently equal to apple, okay? Let's say we had an if condition, or an if statement, sorry, that says if $fruit is equal to apple, then display message it's an apple. Okay. We could then do an else that says $fruit. Sorry. Display message it's a banana, let's say. Let's say you had a variable that could either be one of two things. It could either be an apple or it could be a banana, okay? So we've got an if statement here that's saying if fruit is apple, then display message it's an apple. Otherwise, if it's not an apple, then it must be a banana, so display message it's a banana, okay? Now that's a, perfectly fine if condition, if statement, right? But some people might be tempted to write it a different way. Some people might be tempted to write if fruit equals apple, then display message it's an apple, and then end that if. And then write a second one that says if fruit equals banana, then display message it's a banana. Okay? So they're two completely separate if statements. If we apply and save that, you can see that they're two completely separate evaluate conditions. We've got one here that's saying it's an apple, and then this ends and comes down to a second evaluate condition that then checks a completely separate version of it for if it's a banana. It's a bit more complicated to look at on the visual script, so I'm going to explain it in the text. Let's go full screen on this for a second. So, in the case of the variable being either apple or banana, it's fine. This would still work. So for most intents and purposes, this is still fine. But it's not a good habit to get into because, and I'm going to explain why in a second. But the point is, we've taken a single if statement, an if and an else, and we've split it out into two separate if statements checking the same variable. So if fruit is apple, then display message it's an apple. And then separately to that, if it's banana, then display message it's a banana. Okay? Let me give you a practical example of why this isn't good to do. Let's say we have a global property, which you wouldn't obviously set in the same script, but I'm just putting it in the same script to talk about it. Let's say we had a global property which had state and it equals, to begin with, closed. Okay, so we've got a closed global property for a state. Okay, and we want a script that toggles between opening and closing a door depending on the state that it is. Right, so we're going to have an if statement that says if global property state is equal to closed, then let's just say there was a function called open door. There isn't, but just pretend there's a function called open door, and then you would pass in the ID of the door. So let's say door 1. Okay, and then what we would do is we'd just change the property to reflect the fact that now the door state is open. Okay, so we'll do that. Okay, and then we'll come down to our second if, and we'll say if global.property door state equals open, then let's just grab these two, paste, then let's say there was a function called close door, and we would set this now to closed. Okay, that seems perfectly valid. If the door state is closed, then open the door. If the door state is open, then close the door, right? That makes perfect sense. You know, the logic is sound, but the problem is this script isn't going to work the way you think it's going to work. So I'm going to leave this on screen for a couple of seconds, and I want you to just take a look at the code and see if you can already start to think for yourself why this might not work. So I'll give you a little clue if you're struggling to think about it. The clue is, remember that scripts are executed top down, from top to bottom. So it's going to do this script in order. Okay, so now think about what it's going to try and do. What's this script going to try to do? Okay, so if you've got it, then great. It means you've grasped why it's really important to do if statements a particular way. If you haven't got it, then I'll quickly explain the issue. So these are basically two completely separate if statements, and the code is going to be treated as such when it executes. So what's going to happen is, ignoring this, that's just to show that we've got a variable that starts set to closed. Okay, so ignore this line. This script is going to check if the door is closed. So it's going to say if the door state is closed, which it is, because it starts closed. So it's going to say, yep, that's the case. So it's then going to open the door, fine, and then it's going to set the door to open. Great. But then it's going to end that if statement, fine, done. And then it goes down to the next if statement, and it's going to do this, and it's going to say, is it open? Well, yes, it now is, because we just changed it in the line above. So now this is going to be true. So now this if statement is going to go, oh, well, it's true. So now what I need to do is close the door and set it to closed. So in essence, what you've just made is a code where what happens when you run it is the door will open and then immediately close again, because it will see that it's closed, open it, and then set the variable to be open. But then your second if statement will be valid. This wouldn't have been valid at the beginning of the script because it's set to this, but now you've set it to this. This is suddenly valid, and so the script is going to execute that immediately afterwards. So this is going to completely undo what you just did in the if statement above. Okay? So what we actually want to do is we want this script to only do one of two things. We don't want it to do both. We want it to do one of two things. If it's closed, open it and then stop. If it's open, close it and stop. We want it not to do two things. We want it to do one of them. And that's why what you do is you use either else if you want to specify the condition, or in this case, we could just say else, and then that's the equivalent. If global property door state is closed, then open the door and set the property to open. And then when it reaches else, it knows not to do the rest of this, because else, in the case of the first execution of this code, it knows that else is not applicable because it's already done this. So else, therefore, gets ignored. And then it jumps from here down to here. And it does everything that comes after your if condition. The next time you run this script, because this has changed, it will read this line, see that it's not set to that, so ignore all of this and instead do everything here. So what we've done is we've converted those two if statements where they're both going to run, and we've turned it into one that will only do one of the other depending on which state it's set to. Is that clear? So it's really important to understand that, because that's where a lot of beginners can, if they don't understand how if statements work, can come a cropper with this, is that, separate if conditions are fine as long as the if conditions are completely separate. So for example, if I said if global property door state is closed, then open door, and then set it to open, that's fine. And then if I had another if statement that said if player dot help, again, not a valid thing, but just to give an example, less than 100, then do something end, that's fine, because these two if statements are checking two completely different things, and therefore you as the coder are expecting them to both do their things separately from one another. But if this is another check of what this property is set to, it's best to be done within the same if that checks this property. So if it's set to closed, then do this, else do this, or else if it's set to this, do this, else if it's set to this, do that. Never do two checks of the same property in separate if statements, because it will do both of them. And if your first if changes that property so that the second one suddenly becomes valid, it will then do the next one immediately afterwards, which could potentially mean you have a script that's doing things it shouldn't be doing, or undoing something you did earlier, like for example closing a door that was supposed to now be open. So I hope that's clear as well. So that's evaluate conditions, or if statements. Okay, they're basically just checking that a variable or a piece of data in your game is equal to something, and then doing something if it is, doing other things if it equals other things, and if it's anything else, doing something else in that situation. Does that make sense? So else if you want to do something specific, and else if it's just anything other than the ones you're checking for. Okay? So with that said, that'll wrap up this video on variables. I hope it's been helpful and interesting. Stay tuned for the next tutorial.